The Hillsdale Distinguished Fellowship is a particular honor for me because my maternal grandfather was born in Hillsdale, Michigan, and was if I think I remember this correctly, was a graduate of Hillsdale College, the class of 1942. And so it's quite an incredible thing to have gone, last year to teach a one-credit course to the college, and to see Hillsdale and to imagine what it was like in the 1930s in the Depression when he was growing up, and in the 1940s and after the war when he came back. And so it's kind of a nice family angle. But those happy and maybe halcyon memories aside, we're here to talk about something very serious, something very dark, and something that is threatening families and kids all over the United States. You've seen it with activist teachers pushing radical gender theory in the classroom. You've seen it with so-called trans influencers polluting TikTok and other social media platforms. And you've also seen it, unfortunately and most grotesquely, in major children's hospitals across the country, which are cutting up kids in the name of so-called gender-affirming care. And so what I've been working on the last year, among a few other projects, is to try to figure out where this ideology comes from, how it attained power, and then most importantly, how it can be stopped. The story goes much deeper than you might imagine, and I'd like to take my 20 or 30 minutes tonight to tell you the basic story of trans ideology and how it migrated into the classroom, how it migrated into the operating room, and really how it came to conquer a vast portion of the American mind. The first step of this is to understand what you might think of as Transgenderism 101. It's to understand the ideology, and it's to understand it ideologically first and foremost because it is not a sexual orientation. It is not even per se a romantic desire. What it is a political belief system that merges ideology with technology with power. And the intersection of those three forces is really where it's been most successful. If we go back to the late 1980s, you see a group of writers and queer theorists and gender theorists, including Judith Butler, Gail Rubin, Sandy Stone, and Susan Stryker, who established the disciplines of queer theory and transgender studies. The basic argument is something I think by now many people are familiar with, that gender is a social construct that's used to oppress racial and sexual minorities, and the categories of man and woman represent a false binary that must be shattered in order to break the broader system of heteronormativity, a very fancy, multisyllabic, Latinate word for something that maybe in the Black Panther era they would have said very clearly, the white male heterosexual power structure. That's really what they mean by that. And these gender theorists, and then the transgender theorists after them, made the case that all of these systems are arbitrary, they're contingent, they're infinitely malleable, they're unrelated to human nature, which they take as a myth. And so the most dramatic way for them to deconstruct gender, sex, man, woman, is through transgender ideology, and then of course through transgender practice. And the basic gambit here is that if a man can become a woman, and if a woman can become a man, the entire structure of creation can be subverted. I'd like to quote briefly one of the most influential figures in this movement, a man called Susan Stryker, male to female transgender professor, one of the founding theorists, who describes his work as, quote, a secular sermon that unabashedly advocates embracing a disruptive and refigurative genderqueer or transgender power as a spiritual resource for social and environmental transformation. Stryker has taken on some of the verbiage of Judith Butler, very much kind of dense and jargon-laden text. But in another essay that I think is even more important, Stryker appeals to none other than Dr. Victor Frankenstein as inspiration. This is not something that you would see today. Today, it's gender-affirming care. It's taking care of kids. It's someone was born in the wrong body. Almost nursery rhyme language to make the transgender ideology and practice seem social scientific, to seem medical, to seem anodyne, to seem unthreatening. But in the 80s and 90s, the true nature of transgender ideology was revealed in stark terms. Stryker argues that the transsexual body is a, quote, technological construction that, in his framing, represents a war against Western society. Stryker writes, quote, "I am a transsexual and therefore I am a monster." And this monster is destined, throughout this essay, to perform a function of what he calls rage and revenge against a series of targets that we see over and over in this ideology: the naturalized heterosexual order, traditional family values, and the hegemonic oppression of nature itself. These are all of the targets of transgender ideology. And as you see over time, the goal of transgender ideology starts to merge with other elements of left-wing thinking. It takes on a racial component, trying to bring in the hierarchy, or rather the hierarchy of oppression of race. And it also starts to bring in a specific ideological objective. There was a book, a collection of essays titled very bluntly and very straightforwardly, Transgender Marxism, in which activists believed that in order to truly abolish heteronormativity, you had to also abolish capitalism. So, you think about it, quite ambitious. We're not only going to abolish the basic nature of reality, man and woman, dimorphic sex, but we're also going to abolish the entire economic and political system as a kind of bonus or extra. One of the writers in this text writes something very interesting that I'd like to again quote. The activist Rosa Lee argues, quote, "In a different era, Marxists spoke of the construction of a new socialist man as a crucial task in the broader process of socialist construction. Today, in a time of both rising fascism and an emergent socialist movement, our challenge is transsexualizing our Marxism. We should think the project of transition to communism in our time, communization, as including the transition to new communist selves, new ways of being and relating to one another." And I think that together, this represents really the culmination, that most sharp focal point of transgender ideology. It is to erase the distinctions of human nature. It is to erase the categories of man and woman. And it is to marshal technology towards a utopian and idealistic political goal. Marxism in some cases, and maybe some garden variety socialism in others. So academics have been, bloviating and writing very dense, jargon-rich texts that very few people read for many decades. So the question is, well, Chris, are you cherry-picking? Are you taking examples out of context? Is this really a big deal, or is this just a couple people that are speculating within academia? The answer, I wish that were true, but the answer, unfortunately, is that it's not true. And in fact, what I've seen in my reporting and what is obvious and you've seen in your daily life and your reading and your observation is that this ideology has taken on maybe a more sophisticated marketing pitch, but it has migrated to all of our institutions. So that you may have gotten an email, for example, that says, project manager, Rosa Lee or, Rosa Smith, they, them pronouns, or ze-zer pronouns. I'm actually currently under a federal civil rights investigation for refusing to use ze-zer pronouns. So if you think that this is not something that is being taken seriously by people in power, you are unfortunately, or maybe, I wish you were wrong, but unfortunately you're not wrong. But I can handle myself, not really concerned about the Biden administration too much. I can hold my own. But what I am concerned about is the creation of a school-to-gender clinic pipeline targeting kids. Hillsdale College can defend itself. New College of Florida can defend itself. I can defend myself. But in many cases, they're going after kids who cannot. Kids that are vulnerable. Kids that may not have two parents in the household. Kids that may have other issues that they're struggling with. They are the explicit targets of a campaign to recruit them into an ideology. And I've showed that over a long period of time and a long series of reports. And I'd like to just tell you in one city how this works. You may have heard of this city. It's Chicago, Illinois. It's a big one. And it's an instructive example of how the ideology spreads because there are a few key influential people. One of them is a man named Jennifer Pritzker. Pritzker, born James Pritzker in 1950, served a career in the U.S. military and inherited a sizable part of the Hyatt Hotel fortune. Significant amount of cash. In 2013, Pritzker announced a male-to-female gender transition. He was heralded by newspapers as the first trans billionaire, kind of a distinction of some kind. But whatever a middle-aged man wants to do, okay, it's his own private time and dime. Perhaps some latitude should be afforded. But for Pritzker, this wasn't merely a personal decision. This was an ideological commitment. He began donating untold millions of dollars to universities, schools, hospitals, and activist organizations to promote queer theory and transgender medical experiments. Meanwhile, another gentleman named J.B. Pritzker, his cousin, the governor of Illinois, signed legislation pushing gender theory in the state curriculum and directing state Medicaid funds towards transgender surgeries. So you have a kind of inside-outside game in politics and philanthropy, funding all of these institutions, creating a core of activists, and then deploying them in public schools through these partnerships, as well as in other institutions. The materials that are produced by some of these organizations, including Lurie Children's Hospital, the largest hospital in Chicago, are quite shocking. I did a story uncovering these documents that were provided to me by a source. And what they've done is quite interesting. They've recruited radical gender activists onto the hospital staff, people with no medical training, no medical job, no medical function, pure activism, laundered through the legitimacy of the largest children's hospital in the city. So they've taken it out of the ideology of Susan Stryker bellowing, "I am a monster," and appealing to Dr. Frankenstein. And now they're saying, we're going to work through the hospitals and through the schools and legitimize this ideology using those means of transmission. So what kind of materials are they pushing in Chicago's elementary and middle and high schools? Cover your ears if you're bashful, but they were not only exposing children to trans ideology, but to kink, BDSM, breast binders, and artificial penis packers. Their goal, and they say this explicitly in the material, is to disrupt entrenched norms in Western society and to guide vulnerable students, for example, those who might suffer from anxiety, depression, autism, in particular we've seen, towards gender medicine as the cure. And this also became policy at many of these public schools that invited Lurie Children's Hospital in to do these activist training sessions. And in fact, the Chicago Public Schools explicitly adopted a policy that teachers and counselors and administrators in their public schools were required to, they say, maintain the privacy of students, but I would actually say more accurately, they were empowered to facilitate child sexual transitions and keep it a secret from parents. Getting over a cold, excuse me. And meanwhile, activists are flooding social media with these kind of messages. I'm sure you've seen them. They're quite frightening and they're quite very much everywhere. And I would like to read a quote from a Chicago area detransitioner, someone who embarked on a transition and then headed back. And she says quite poignantly, "When I was 15, I was introduced to gender ideology on social media and began to call myself non-binary. Over the next few years, I would continue to go deeper and deeper down the trans identity rabbit hole, and by the time I was 18, I saw myself as a trans man." And of course, this person went to the city of Chicago to connect with not only activists but medical providers who would provide her with anything that she wanted as far as hormones and other therapies. Where does this lead? Trans activists often say that puberty blockers, for example, you've probably heard this, have no long-term side effects and are completely reversible. You heard this? In a way, the lie is so brazen, it's almost shocking, but according to the medical literature, it's not reversible at all in practice. You can have lifelong health complications, but moreover, 95% of kids who begin puberty blockers move on to cross-sex hormones. Only 5% desist or back away. And 50% of females who begin cross-sex hormones move on to trans-affirming surgeries. I think it's quite fair to say is that once they're in for life.